In your life, faith will always tell a different story than fear. Our lives are made up of opportunities each and every single day where we get to choose. Where we get to choose whether faith is going to direct us or fear is going to direct us. You see, you may not be able to choose the content of each chapter of your story, but you can always choose whether you let faith or fear direct your path. And faith will always tell a different story than fear. In John chapter 11, we find a family that's struggling with one of the most troubling things a family could ever struggle with. Their loved one is going to pass away. You see, this family in John chapter 11 had reached the end of what they were capable of doing. It was something that they couldn't fix. It was something that they didn't know how to make it work. They had reached the very end of themselves. There was nothing more that they could do. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Maybe you're facing something right now that you don't know how to fix. Maybe you're facing something right now that you don't know what to do, and there's nothing that you can do to make it different. And in the midst of this chapter of your story, you get to make a choice. You can choose to either let faith direct your path or fear. You see, in John chapter 11, we find Mary and Martha struggling with the impending death of their brother Lazarus. And instead of choosing the path of fear, they choose to reach out to God and choose to let faith direct their path. In chapter 11, verse 3, it says that they sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. But this just wasn't a message. It wasn't just a push notification on his phone just to keep him informed. When Mary and Martha reached out to Jesus, it was actually an invitation for him to enter into this chapter of their story. You see, there are crucial moments in our lives where we get to choose whether faith or fear will direct us, and faith always tells us a different story than fear. You know, Jesus was 100 miles away when he got this message. But when we invite Jesus or God into our stories, God always shows up where he's invited, and this is exactly what Jesus does. In verse 4, he says a phrase, he responds to this message. He says, you know, this sickness of Lazarus, it's not going to end in death. But this is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God can be glorified. You see, Jesus had spent his entire ministry inviting people to come and see something different. He had spent his entire ministry inviting them to come and see that their God was a powerful God. He invited them to come and see that God was a personal God. That he named his sheep, each and every single one of them, like we talked about in John chapter 10 last week. And now what Jesus is inviting this family to see in the midst of the darkest time of their lives is that God is a present God. See, God always shows up where he has been invited. And now that God has been invited into this chapter of their story, he's got something that he's going to do and something that he's going to say, because faith always tells a different story than fear. In verse 4, Jesus tells his disciples to say, okay, now we are going to meet them exactly where they are at. You know, we don't know why Jesus decided to stay in that area for 2 more days, but we do know that he stopped everything that he was doing so that he could be with the people he loved in the midst of their story. You see, that the same thing is true in your life as well. The reality is this: God didn't create the circumstances in this chapter for Mary and Martha. God is not the author of sin and death. You see, Scripture clearly reveals that Satan is the author of sin and death. But even though God isn't the author of this chapter in their story, God isn't absent. You see, God shows up and he meets them exactly where they are at. And in your story, and that thing that you're carrying or the thing that you're struggling with, God may not be the author of that story, but he's not absent in the middle of your story. You see, faith moves forward, but fear never does. Jesus was trying to get this message to his disciples. He told them that they were going back to Judea. In verse 7 and in verse 8, they replied and said, Jesus, we can't go back to Judea. It's dangerous there. You see, faith was moving Jesus forward, but the disciples were still trapped in fear. They were being directed by fear. You see, fear was directing them to stay where they were at because it was safe. Fear was directing them to stay where they at, because if they went into this new area, if they took a step outward in faith, things may get a little bit messy for them. But Jesus tells them that faith always moves forward. And more than that, he tells them that they have exactly what they need to move forward. He shares with them just a few verses later that they have a light inside of them. And that if they choose to walk and be directed by faith, that light inside of them will always direct their next step. So when you're facing things in your life and you're unsure, when you're in that moment in your life where you're trying to decide, what do I do? It's easier if I stay here. I know it's not messy. I don't have to figure anything out. I can just stay where I am. Faith is always going to move you forward, and it's going to give you exactly what you need. There's this quote by Bob Goff that I like. It says, wanting to have all the answers now isn't bad. It's just not faith. Do what you can. Be courageous and stay the course. You see, Jesus was telling them that faith doesn't mean that you have to have everything figured out. Jesus was telling them that faith doesn't mean that things aren't going to be messy. But Jesus was telling them to let faith move them forward rather than just stay where they're at in fear, because they have exactly what they need. Do the next right thing and take the next step forward and move forward in faith. Because faith will always tell a different story than fear, even though it isn't always easy. You see, where we find Martha after Jesus comes into town, she isn't acting like somebody who is choosing to walk fully in faith. In verse 17 it says, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You see, Mary, or Martha, she started off going and walking and letting faith direct her, but she ended up sitting on the fence trying to balance faith and fear. Have you ever been in that place? Have you ever faced a situation where you've taken 2 steps in faith, but now you find yourself sitting on the fence not knowing where to go? You see, even though Martha started on the path of faith, she ended up on the fence, but the most beautiful part of this is that God always shows up where He's invited, and He meets Martha exactly where she is at. He says, Martha, your brother is going to be raised again. And she responds to say, yeah, I know that will happen one day. You see, she didn't understand that God was there and present with her. So Jesus questions her. He says, Martha, do you believe that I'm the resurrection and the life? Because if you believe that and you have faith and you let that direct you, then that is going to tell you a different story than your fear. And what He's telling Martha is, in that moment, is Martha, you don't have to wait for this to take place, because I am here now, present with you. Even in the midst of your mess, even in the midst of all of your questions, even in the midst of all of your doubt, I am here with you. It's almost as if He met Martha where she was sitting on the fence and extended a hand to her, helping her and guiding her and inviting her to walk fully in faith and to let faith direct her. You see, Jesus extends the same invitation to you, because walking and being directed by faith doesn't mean that we have it all figured out. Being directed by faith doesn't mean that things aren't going to be messy, but it does mean that when we walk and we are directed by faith, that God is present with us. And whatever you're trying to navigate right now, whatever that situation may be, whatever that struggle may be, whatever that sin may be in your life, Jesus meets you exactly where you are at. And you don't have to wait for that to happen. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it figured out, because God meets you in the middle of your mess. See, Jesus was inviting her to walk fully in her faith. Because when that happens, our stories are worth telling. You see, when faith directs your story is worth telling. You can tell a story of how God met you in one of the darkest places of your life, and you decided to take and be directed by faith and no longer be controlled by fear. You see, you can tell that story. You can tell the story that even though you didn't have everything figured out, that God met you exactly where you're at, and you let faith direct your path. You can tell the story about, it wasn't safe, and I didn't have it figured out, and I didn't have all the answers, but I know that God was present with me, and He directed my next step, and then the step after that, and then the step after that. You see, when you walk fully in faith, your story is worth telling, because you don't miss the opportunities that pass you by when you're just standing still in fear. You see, Martha's story was one where she accepted the invitation to walk fully in faith. And she shared that story. She shared that story with Mary. So she went out and met Jesus on the road, but then she went back and she got Mary. And Jesus traveled with her and met her in the middle of her mess. They went to the tomb where Lazarus was buried. The darkest, most sensitive spot that Mary and Martha were struggling with in their life. He didn't pass it by. He didn't simply say a few words. He walked and navigated that path with them. And He will walk and navigate those paths with you. Jesus was deeply moved when He came to the tomb in verse 38. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone. Take away the thing that is keeping this person trapped in fear." And a little bit later on, Jesus enters into that space and He transforms it. When He's having a conversation with Mary, He says, "You see, I told you that if you walk fully in faith, that your story would change. I think he's telling us that amazing things are possible in our stories when we let faith direct us rather than fear. Jesus meets them right where they're at, and he says the word, Lazarus, rise. And Lazarus rises up, but there's this powerful verse at the very end. There's a powerful verse in verse 44 where he says, take off his grave clothes and let him go. You see, Jesus was invited into their story, and he showed up, and he was present, and he was powerful, and he was personal. And after he was invited into that story, their story began to change. Because faith always tells a different story than fear. And when Jesus sees Lazarus come out of the grave and rise up from that situation and rise up from that story, he tells them to get rid of the things that keep him trapped in the past. He tells them to take off the things that are keeping him trapped in fear. You see, God is telling you the same thing here today. He is inviting you and hoping that you make a choice in the midst of your story to invite him into your story and to choose to let faith direct you. And he wants you to take off all the things that are keeping you trapped in your past, because faith always tells a different story than fear. You know, the reality is there's a lot of things going on in our world that have us afraid right now. You know, COVID-19, not to be an alarmist, but I think where we're at, we're just now starting to see the beginning of its impact here. And there's a lot of fear associated with this. And when we look at COVID-19 and this pandemic, we can either let faith direct us or we can let fear direct us. I was listening to a message by Andy Stanley, and he said something powerful that I want to share with you. He said this. He said, when the story of COVID-19 is just a story we tell, whether it's a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, let's make sure our stories are worth telling. You see, the choices that you make today determine the story that you tell tomorrow. The choices that you make today are going to determine the story that you're going to tell your children and your grandchildren. And we are writing that story every single day, every single moment, with every single decision that we make. And when we're fearful, it's easy for us to retreat in fear, to want to preserve our life. But just because we retreat in fear, it doesn't mean that our lives are going to be preserved. You see, fear, when we let fear write our stories, it means that we lose the opportunity to do something extraordinary during this season of our lives. If you respond only in fear during this time, you're missing an opportunity to do something extraordinary. Can I just ask you personally, what is directing your story right now? In the midst of all this distancing, in the midst of all this disruption, what is directing your story? Because I believe when we let faith direct our stories, then we can have a story worth telling. So maybe for you, that means that you go and you check up on your neighbor. Maybe they don't need any physical resources. Maybe they're okay on canned food and toilet paper, but you know what? Maybe they just want somebody to talk to. And maybe that can happen through a phone call. I had a conversation with my friend last night, and he shared a story that he received a phone call from a church that he used to go to. He hadn't been to the church in years, and it was in a different state, in a different city, but they still took the time out to call. And when they discovered that he didn't live there anymore, they still asked him, hey, how can I pray with you today? So maybe for you, it's reaching out to your neighbor. And maybe for you, it's simply going deeper. You know, fear makes us do things that'll distract ourselves. But what if God is calling you to go deeper into a relationship with Him during this time? We've offered a few things on our website and our Facebook page, and we're going to direct you there. But no matter what you're facing today, no matter what situation you're carrying, when you choose to let faith tell your story, it's always going to tell a different story than fear. May God be with you. Amen.